Good morning, students. Once again, we are back to An Angel in Disguise. I hope you like this story. We had reached up to the climax where Maggie has a turning point in her life where she experienced a kind of bond between her and between Joe Thompson. We know how Kate and Johns were taken by Mr. John and Mrs. Kelly, and the poor sick child was left alone. And how Thompson became so compassionate and takes the little crippled child into his house, and how Maggie fervently requests Thompson to take her, and he couldn't ignore the call of his own conscience and also the cry of the poor. So we see in Joe Thompson a very compassionate man, although with a rough exterior. We come to know how he had a soft spot in his heart. His conscience kept pricking him. And then he decides, although in great dilemma at the end, he decides to take little Maggie into his house. In the coming lines on page 80, I suppose that we need to start with page 80, we find the description on Mrs. Jane, Joe Thompson's wife. Are you all ready? Right. Now, Joe Thompson's wife, who happened to be childless, was not a woman of saintly temper. The first explanation why she is ill tempered, why she is not a woman of saintly temper, is given. Why? Because she happened to be a childless woman. And you know, the fulfillment of a woman is to have a child, and then taking care, nourishing a child is the fulfillment of a woman. But here she is a barren. Okay, she happened to be a childless woman. That made her life a bitter, and she remains a ill-tempered woman. And adding to that, nor much given to self-denial for others' good. And adding to that, she had no any kind of compassion, or she never felt good in doing good for others. And Joe had well grounded doubts touching the manner of greeting he would receive on his arrival. And he was so scared what kind of welcoming he would receive on the approach to his wife with this crippled child. He was so unsure how his wife would be reacting to this situation. Mrs. Thompson saw him approaching from the window, and with ruffling feathers met him a few paces from the door as he opened the garden gate and came in. Now, from far only Mrs. Thompson could see the approach of Mr. Thompson, and she must have seen him carrying the child. And with ruffling feathers means she rushed in to meet him as he opened the garden gate. He bore a precious burden, and he felt it to be so. Precious burden. He felt it to be so. See the words precious and burden. These both are opposite in nature, contradictory in nature, but the author puts these words together. It is the figure of what is that? The rhetoric device used here is oxymoron. Two contradictory things put together to give a different twist in its meaning. Here, the precious burden, the crippled child Maggie is a burden actually which nobody wanted. But for Joe Thompson, it becomes precious, because we come to know in the coming line why he feels so precious about this child. Some kind of change is taking place in him. We come to know in the coming line why he tells the word precious. As his arms held the sick child to his breast, a sphere of tenderness went out from her and penetrated his feelings. As soon as he took the child in his arms and kept her close to his heart, he felt a kind of different feeling altogether. Penetrated his feeling means he could feel the tenderness very much within his heart. In the coming lines, you will also come to know heart was welling up with the tenderness. a bond had already corded itself. Corded itself means it had bound them together. A bond, a relationship had already formed between whom? Between Joe Thompson and Maggie. And love was springing into life. Love was springing into life. The other rhetoric device, personification, is used here. Love was springing into life. Love is given the characteristic of a person. Love was springing into life. So he could feel a kind of love, warmth, feeling of life in his own dried, arid life. He was also a kind of, there was no life in their family because they were childless. And that life has come back to Joe Thompson. What have you there? Sharply questioned Mrs. Thompson. Yes, that ill tempered woman, she was not only ill tempered, but her words were also very sharp. So sharp tongued she is. She asked him, "What have you there?" Joe felt the child start and shrink, alliteration, against him. So already the child felt a kind of commotion and the fear within him, and Joe could feel the child was shaken with fear. He did not reply except by a look that was pleading and cautionary. He didn't want to reply, so he gave her a kind of look that was pleading and cautionary, means he was both pleading as well as he was warning her not to speak. And he said, "Wait a moment for explanations and be gentle." So he requested her, pleaded her to be gentle, and he said, "I will give you explanation to my action, but give me some time." And passing in, carried Maggie to the small chamber on the first floor and laid her on a bed. So he carried the child to the first floor in a small room and laid her on a bed. Then stepping back, he shut the door. Shut the door. So there is a meaning, children, why he shut the door. He didn't want Maggie to hear what his wife is going to speak. He knew his wife to be so pungent, so very sharp. And so he didn't want to hurt the little child anymore. Already the child is wounded and hurt with the death of his mother and the loss of her siblings. And so Joe Thompson didn't want to hurt the child anymore. So he shut the door against him and his wife and stood face to face with his vinegar tempered wife in the passageway outside. So he decided to face his wife. The vinegar tempered means so very bad tempered, very ill tempered woman, ill tempered wife. "You haven't brought home that sick brat." So the next lines, listen children. So she is so very pungent in her speech. "You haven't brought home that sick brat." Sick brat here means useless child or a mischievous child. Anger and astonishment were in the tones of Mrs. Joe Thompson. Both she was angry as well as she was so much surprised. Astonishment means with a great surprise. So she was so greatly surprised by the action being done by her husband. And so it was reflecting in the tones with which she spoke. Her face was in a flame. In a flame means red with anger. Okay, she was so red with rage, red with anger. "I think women's hearts are sometimes very hard." So he said, "I think women's hearts are sometimes very hard." A general statement, but hinting at her more. Okay, he said, "I feel myself so much compassionate towards the child, but why don't you, as a woman, feel mercy and compassion towards this poor little thing?" So he put a statement, "I think women's hearts are sometimes very hard." Usually, Joe Thompson got out of his wife's way or kept rigidly silent and non combative when she fired up on any subject. It was with some surprise, therefore, that she now encountered a firmly set countenance and a resolute pair of eyes. So, in usual terms, what Joe used to do, he used to get away from his wife whenever any argument arose between them. And now he has decided something. He is ready to speak. He used to kept rigidly silent and non-combative. He for, used to force himself to be silent, and non-combative means not to fight. In order to not save the situation, not to fight, he used to move away whenever she fired up on any subject. It was with some surprise, therefore, that she now encountered a firmly set countenance and a resolute pair of eyes. And so she was so surprised to see Joe to speak something to her. Usually he gets out of the situation, or else he used to be silent, but here he has spoken up. And so it was with the surprise she encountered this firm eyes or firm countenance in her husband. And he had a resolute pair of eyes. He was convinced of something. He has taken some kind of resolution that was seen in his eyes. Women's hearts are not half so hard as men's. Who replied? Jane did not leave. So she said, women's hearts are not half so hard as men's. So she said, women's hearts are compassionate but not as hard as men. Joe saw by a quick intuition that his resolute bearing had impressed his wife. So he understood his resolute pair of eyes or his firm countenance has impressed his wife. He could understand some kind of difference his wife has learned from the situation. And so he answered quickly and with the real indignation. Indignation means showing a kind of a little anger when some injustice is done. Okay, when something perceived as offense or injustice, somebody shows some kind of anger. Okay, so he showed some kind of real indignation. Be that as it may. So he said, okay, if what you said, women's hearts are not half so hard as men's, I give you an explanation. So he is trying to give an explanation to his wife, telling, every woman at the funeral turned her eyes steadily from the sick child's face, and when the cart went off with her dead mother, hurried away and left her alone in that old hut with the sun not an hour in the sky. Now he says, women are not as compassionate as you think, because there were many women when the funeral rite was going on there, but everyone hurried away, leaving the sick child when the cart of the dead mother was taken. And this poor child was left alone, and none turned to the sick child. No, she doesn't give up. She asks, where were John and Kate? Asked Mrs. Thompson. Farmer Jones tossed John into his wagon and drove off. Katy went home with Mrs. Ellis, but nobody wanted the poor sick one. Send her to the poor house was the cry. So Joe decided to tell her what has taken place there. He gives politely an explanation to what had happened there. He says, Farmer Jones took John and Mrs. Ellis took Katy for their own interest, and nobody took the poor little child. Why didn't you let her go then? Why did you bring her here? So she asked, why? Then you did not take her to the poor house. Everyone else said, take her to the poor house. And why did you not take her to the poor house? And why you brought her in? For what have you? What did you bring her for? For what purpose have you brought this child to our dwelling? Now listen the reply, the answer of Joe Thompson. Beautifully he says, "She can't walk to the poorhouse," said Joe. "Somebody's arms must carry her, and mine are strong enough for that task." So he says, okay, it is very agreeable way. He says, she cannot, this crippled child cannot walk herself alone to the poorhouse. Somebody has to carry. And he already gives her an explanation earlier that everybody hurried away, leaving the child alone. And finally, he says, "My arms are strong enough to carry her, and so I carried." This line speaks that he has taken a resolution, or he has decided to take care of this little crippled child. Not only to take her to the poor, not just to take her to the poorhouse, but he has decided to keep her in their own house. So he was so very resolute in his answer. "Then why didn't you keep on?" So Jane is not leaving the situation. Mrs. Thompson is not leaving the situation. So she asks again, "Then why didn't you keep on? Why did you stop here?" demanded the wife. "Then why didn't you carry her to the poorhouse? Why you stopped here?" "Because I am not apt to go on fool's errands." Beautiful answer, isn't it? Here, fool's errands means, children, a task or activity that has no hope of success. So he explained, going to the poorhouse right away will be a foolish act, so I didn't want to go. And he explained, the guardians must first be seen and a permit obtained. So there is a procedure in putting a child into the poorhouse. You cannot just keep a child there. You need to meet the guardians first, make the documents ready, take a permit from them. Only then you can put a child in the poorhouse. There was no gainsaying this. So even that could not satisfy Mrs. Jane Thompson. So she says, "When will you see the guardians?" was asked with irrepressible impatience. So she couldn't tolerate anymore. She does not give up to her husband. She asked, "When will you see the guardians? When are you going to take the child?" With the irrepressible means not controllable. She could not control her emotions. He couldn't control her what feelings. He was so impatient, so intolerant, and asked, when will you meet the guardians?" "Tomorrow." "Why put it off till tomorrow?" So she again argued with him, telling, "Why do you keep it for tomorrow? Why can't you take it tonight? Go at once for the permit and get the whole thing off of your hands tonight. Tonight, by today itself, you need to finish all this matter here and now." So she becomes so very, very argumentative, and she doesn't want to come by with her husband. Jane set the wheel right with an impressiveness of tone that greatly subdued his wife. At last, he called her name with such kind of impressiveness. The tone had its own effect on her that subdued his wife. I read in the Bible sometimes and find much said about little children, how the Savior rebuked the disciples who would not receive them, how he took them up in his arms and blessed them, and how he said that whatever or whosoever gave them even a cup of cold water should not go unrewarded. Now, it is a small thing for us to keep this poor motherless little one for a single night, to be kind to her for a single night, to make her life comfortable for a single night. See, now he knew some way he has to make his wife understand. So Thompson trying to explain to her in different ways, and at the end he takes up the values from the Bible. He feels all his false excuses won't work for long with his wife, and he firmly urges his wife to learn the value of kindness from the Bible. He is quoting the Bible words. He says, I read in the Bible sometimes and find much said about little children. So here it is a reference to the gospel of the four gospels are there. You must be knowing, and in that, in Saint Matthew's Gospel, chapter 19, verses 14, we hear when disciples, Jesus along with his disciples were talking, children came in and then they were disturbing, and so the disciples wanted to chase the children away. It's then Jesus says, let the children come to me. It is to them the kingdom belongs. And so Job quotes those lines and says, children are a blessing. It is to them the kingdom belongs. And Jesus always spoke about little children. And he also says, quotes another sentence, another verse from the Bible, that is also from Saint Matthew chapter 10, verses 42. He says, whosoever gave them even a cup of cold water should not go unrewarded. So he says that even a little act of kindness done will not go unrewarded. You will be rewarded for every small things done. And then why can't we do this small little thing, a small thing, to keep this poor motherless little one for a single night, to be kind to her for a single night, to make her life comfortable for a single night. See, 2-3 times the words used single night is being repeated in the same line. It is to give an emphasis to the to give importance to that line. At least for a day, why can't you wait? Why can't you do a small kind of charity for the sake of at least the gospel values, at least the values of Jesus? Thompson felt it was futile to buy time like this. So he mustered all his strength to confront his wife's cruelty with a sense of compassion and decency. So he drew Bible sermon to underline his argument. And finally, he decides to do something his own. Okay, the voice of the strong, rough man shook and he turned his head away so that the moisture in his eyes might not be seen. Mrs. Thompson did not answer, but a soft feeling crept into her heart. At last, he could win his wife. Okay, he himself shook with pain and he started crying, and that had impressed or changed his wife. Okay, Thompson's kindness towards Maggie creeps even into his wife's heart, and we know there is a turn in the story altogether in the coming lines. As for now, I stop it here. All the good wishes, go through it once, twice to understand the lesson, underlined the important words, the rhetorical devices used in it, and then study. Good wishes. God bless you, children.